now is open for me to pass on to our first keynote speaker today, Maryann Martone. Maryann, a long-time friend of mine, is a professor at University of California, San Diego, and her talk today is going to tell us all about the status of global open science and data sharing, with the title, Are We Fair Yet? Over to you, Maryann.
Okay. Hopefully my slides will show up. I think they have to switch something. This microphone does work. Can we get my slides switched over? Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me here. It was my first time to Iceland. I was really looking forward to coming, and it has not disappointed so far. I wasn't exactly sure how to pitch my talk. Alan said I could speak on any topic of my choosing, and I said, well, this is what occupies my time. So I entitled my talk, Are We Fair Yet? Referring, of course, to the FAIR data principles, perspectives on the state of global neuroscience data sharing. And while I'm waiting for my slides to show up, I'll just give my disclaimer that I, in addition to being a professor at UCSD, I am also a founder and shareholder in SciCrunch Incorporated, which is a tech startup out of UCSD that provides tools and services in support of fair resource identification and reproducible science. I'm required to do that by my department. Okay.
Computer?
Yeah, it's supposed to be black. There you go. Yeah. Okay. We'll adapt. Anyway, my first slide these days is usually a big black background and a big 2023 on that background. And the reason why it says 2023 is that in all the years I've been giving talks, usually I spend the first half of my talk trying to convince people that open sharing of neuroscience data is a good thing and is in fact absolutely necessary. But in 2023, in the United States, the National Institutes of Health said after this, all data, not just neuroscience data, will be shared if it can be shared, and all data will be managed. So I no longer, as I like to say, have to convince people that they have to share their data because around the world funders and journals are making people share their data, but rather how one shares it, oh, here we go, effectively. Let's see if this works. But anyway, so after 2023, at least in the United States, and all federal agencies have to follow suit here, all data will be shared if it can be shared, understanding that there are protections for certain types of sensitive data. Interestingly enough, and I will get back to this at the end of my talk, the NIH has a stipulation that regardless of whether data is allowed to be shared publicly, all data will be managed. And I think that's an interesting statement that I'm going to pick up. And that data will be fair. So if you look at a lot of the funding mandates, it's basically that people need to share data in a fair manner. And I'm going to spend the second half of my talk really talking about the nature of fair and where we stand relative to it. I still don't know how to make this advance. Oh, there we go. So a lot of different things happened in order to bring us to this point. And I'm going to take a historical perspective in the first part of the talk to say, how did we happen to get here where in 2023, federal agencies felt confident enough to say, yes, you're going to make your data available. And there's various different trends that fall into this or led us here. Certainly the movements in open science, open neuroscience have been going on for some time. But the two right-hand arrows refer to neuroinformatics, which was really founded in the 1990s, which Alan mentioned on his slides, and deals with the handling of neuroscience information specifically, so it's related to, of course, bioinformatics. And then the technological trends that had to happen and advances to happen so that all of the data that is being produced, and it is being produced on a massive scale now, has a place to go in order to be fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And in my career, it is amazing when one looks back that I started just as the personal computer was starting to be introduced. I remember that my first 3D reconstruction programs were on a mainframe, but very quickly we We went to a PC. As the PCs became available, I was able to write my thesis on a little tiny Mac SE. But if you think about that, right, there was an enormous technological flux that went on in this time. Even now, I just modified my slide last night to put ChatGPT on there because there were constant technological changes that had to happen. I like to say that if NIH had said back in 1990, everybody is going to share their data, there would have been no mechanism to do so. There would not have been the expertise and there would not have been the infrastructure to allow that to happen. But things like the cloud and other things finally makes this feasible. So there was a lot of things that happened in order to bring us here. I'm going to press both buttons, hoping one of them works. Oh, there we go. So why is this so important, and why is data sharing so important in neuroscience? Well, every single talk that has ever started out in neuroscience always puts one variant or another of one of these diagrams here, which reflect the multiple modalities that neuroscientists collect, the multiple scales and time scales over which, the anatomical scales and time scales over which they collect it, and the necessity to understand how each of these scales impacts the others in order to really develop a holistic understanding of the brain. Neuroscience is inherently multi-scale and multimodal, and that is very different, as people like to point out, to things like bioinformatics, which was dealing with relatively simple data types and techniques that could be used to extract it. So it's interesting if you look back at the founding of neuroinformatics, and I don't know if you could read that, it's hard to read it from here, but basically, neuroinformatics, there was a human brain project that was launched in the 90s in the United States. I call that the first human brain project as opposed to the European Human Brain Project. And it was run out of the NIH, the National Institutes of Mental Health, and it was instigated as computers started to come into existence, as the internet started to come into existence, saying that basically we were generating way too much data back then. Of course, we're generating a lot more now, and that we needed some sort of computational infrastructure to be able to handle it. So this is a quote from Mike Herta in 1993, who says, "To this end, the Human Brain Project, an initiative of several NIH institutes and other United States government agencies, is being developed to provide a computer database that will allow neuroscientists access to information at all levels of integration, from genes to behavior." So the early instigation of informatics was really that we were generating too much data. We needed some sort of computer database akin to GenBank or the Protein Data Bank that allowed us to bring all of that data together. And if you look 7 years later, an article was published by Steve Kozlow, who was also one of the leaders of the Human Brain Project, where he laid out his vision for neuroinformatics. This is in 2000, saying, should the neuroscience community make the paradigm shift to sharing primary data? And he envisioned that there would be information storage, immediate information storage of data. That was one of the things he said. So as you generated it, it was going to be immediately stored and made accessible to you. But notice that he switched from a single database that was going to house everything to a federation of distributed databases that were going to house different pieces of the neuroscience slice. So no longer a single database, but multiple different databases, recognizing, again, the inherent complexity of neuroscience data. So it was going to be accessible through a neuroscience portal, because portals just came into existence around then, so this was, advanced, right? Using a smart neuroscience browser, okay? And you were going to be able to type in variables and pull back whatever it is that you needed in order to be able to use it. And then, once you got that, you were going to be able to compare results across different domains, different levels, different scales, whatever it was. So this was the vision of neuroinformatics that was laid out back in 2000. And he also laid out a vision for what open science would be. I have two clickers, and I'm not sure which one works.
I'll get this one.
That one's not the right one? Okay.
This one.
Which do I point it to, like there or there? Anywhere? There it is, okay. So he also considered the question at that time whether neuroscience should be an open science. And he basically said that, the argument is that we needed this paradigm shift in neuroscience. We couldn't integrate data we didn't have access to, and nobody could generate data across all of these scales. So we should be able to get those data openly. But he recognized that although funders and journals could force us to do that, if there wasn't a community buy-in to this, it was going to be a hard road to sell. Right? So he preferred, instead of a top-down, because I remember those of us who were working in the Human Brain Project kept pushing to say, you should make everything open, you should make everything open. And they said, no, 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 we can't do it that way unless the community is willing to come along with us. And it says the potential impact of this was going to be very great, but it would only be realized if researchers came to believe that the incentives for cooperation and sharing was greater than the costs. Right? So there were many, many arguments against why somebody should share their data, and there were arguments for, but I would say in the balance for a very long time, it felt that the negatives outweighed the positives. So, there we go. Steve was actually correct, and I don't know whether he wrote this in reaction to this article or whether this article came out afterwards, but also in 2000, the neuroimaging community in particular rose up and got very angry about an attempt to make them share their data. So there was an early database called the fMRI Data Center, and the head of that happened to also be the editor-in-chief of a journal, and he said, you know, anybody coming to this journal is going to have to put their data into this database. And people got very angry about it, and if you read the Nature article, what they seemed to be angry about was that they were being forced and that they had no say in the matter. So I think Steve was correct, that if you tried to bring people along with, or force them to do it, you were going to get a reaction. And the neuroimaging community, which currently right now is certainly one of the open ones, most open, did not start out that way. There was a lot of resistance to it. And if we now speed forward to 2013, so only 13 years later, we saw when the large brain initiatives were launched around the world, starting with the European Human Brain Project this time, and the US Brain Initiative, Japan James Brain Minds, all of the ones in Australia, Korea, and China. All of these projects launched with a commitment to open. The idea that whatever data was going to be generated needed to be broadly shared. So there was, in fact, a huge paradigm shift, at least at the top of the top scientists that were practicing, whereas before they had been hostile, they were now saying, nope, you know what? If we're going to invest all this money, we need to make this open. So neuroscience actually, did come around even before the mandates were in place. And over the course of my career, I realized when I was putting together a talk for Neuroscience last year, that in fact we had lived through different phases that had various arguments for open. And I categorized them as both promise and obligation. So as you saw, the earliest days of the Human Brain Project in the 90s were, we're generating too much information, we need to be able to handle it, we can share data, we can integrate it, we ourselves can do better science. But then starting around the 2000s with the open science movement and open access journals in particular, people started to say, hey, the taxpayers are paying for this information, they should have access to it. So you started to hear a lot of public good arguments. Then, of course, in around the 2012 and thereabouts, these are approximate dates, you had the problems with rigor and reproducibility that started to become apparent. And so open data, at least, was viewed to be one of the counteractants to the fact that you could not rely often on the results of a published study. And then finally, we're back to promise and driving discovery. And I like this quote from 2013, the age of big data for the brain is upon us. So data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all started to explode around this time, and it's a data-hungry enterprise. It needs data in order to be able to flourish. And it's interesting that when there's a big push, at least in the US, and I'm assuming elsewhere, to make data AI ready and ML ready. And I started to look into exactly what people meant by this. And there's a very interesting thing, which will lead into the second half of my talk. Please note, AI ready does not mean dump any data onto the cloud, right? So there's ways that you have to prepare it in order to make sure that the algorithms are going to be able to use data in an unbiased way and also an informed way. So there are various groups around the world who are putting out principles to say this is what you need to do if you really want to make AI data ready. And it's interesting, and I'll pick this up later, this was The ESIP is the earth science community, and it said, does the data set have metadata? Is it standardized? Is it machine readable? And does it include details on the spatial and temporal extent? So do you have information about the spatial localization of where these signals are coming from? And of course, we're in the Big Brain Conference, and that's very relevant to us. So back in 2021, I was asked to chair a workshop by the National Academies of Science in the US on the new NIH data sharing policy. And it was called Changing the Culture on Data Management and Sharing. And it was a very interesting conference. It went over 2 days. And there was a lot of excitement as well as trepidation. The excitement was that, again, you had started to see this paradigm shift. There are still pockets of resistance, but by and large, people accepted that this was going towards open. And the main concern was that the mandates would lead to that, let's just throw some data in the cloud, and that is considered data sharing. So the tenor of this conference was not that, oh, we need to convince people, but it was, how do we share data well, and how do we incentivize people to share data well, okay? So this is all just a preamble to this question. How do we share data effectively in neuroscience for both humans and machines? And if you've used Google Docs lately, you may see that there is a little Google AI generator, so you can put in a description and it will generate art for you. So I put in computer friendly, and this is what it generated. They're like little happy scenes from a computer, I guess, in a land where all data is computer friendly. I don't know what that had to do with it, but I thought they were very aesthetic. Okay. So of course, when one starts thinking about how one generates data that is computable to both humans and machines, we think of the FAIR data principles. How many people here have heard the term FAIR? Good, I assumed that that was the case. And these were put out in 2014, originally through Force 11, and then a paper was published in 2016. And these were high-level principles that were designed to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And in fact, if you read the paper, the FAIR acronym is used all the time. NIH uses it, everybody else uses it. But there are actually 16 FAIR data principles, or 15 FAIR data principles, that cover various aspects of how you go about making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I find that whereas everybody knows the high-level acronym, fewer people delve into the details, because if you can see, they're sort of cryptic. You know, the data requires a persistent identifier that needs to be described by a plurality of attributes, right? They tend to be fairly cryptic and largely, directed towards, I would say, informaticians and computer scientists rather than your average person. But they're very, very important. And the reason that they were written down was because those of us who had been putting data out there and trying to use data that had been put there on the web encountered all kinds of problems that made data of less value. So that downward trend to saying the more of these practices that you do, the less valuable your data are. So broken links was one of the big ones. That's what persistent identifiers are supposed to help with. But cryptic variables, very little metadata, missing key variables, no provenance, no usage notes, few data standards, and I think we're all familiar with this, 15 different labels for the anterior cingulate cortex, right? So it's very difficult to search across things when everybody uses their own nomenclature. So everything in FAIR was really designed to counteract. That's why they're oddly specific, right? Because these are the practices that those of us working around that time routinely encountered. And if you kind of think about it, I'm not going to go into detail into all of the individual pieces of FAIR, but most of the things that they're asking for are integral to achieving what it is that we need to do in neuroscience to be able to have that magic browser, to be able to look across data and be able to integrate. So identifiers and their importance, machine-readable metadata, data repositories, knowledge representation, data integration, standards, provenance, persistence, all of these can be read into the FAIR data principles, and that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my talk. So I like to think of FAIR as a partnership. That is, the achievement of FAIR does not really rely on, or fall on, I should say, a single individual. It does not fall on the researcher entirely, for example. Rather, you need different actors and stakeholders in order to do FAIR effectively. So what do I mean by that? For example, you see the longest list are with repositories, data repositories. So issuing persistent identifier, putting in place machine-readable metadata, all of these things, implementing standards, are the role of those data repositories that Alan mentioned, and I'm sure many of you have interacted with. So I would say the bulk of operations that have to be done for FAIR really require these data repositories who are the stewards of the data and make it available long term. But researchers are not off the hook. Researchers themselves, first of all, have to submit to a repository. So you don't manage your own data, you don't share your own data on your website, which we saw an awful lot of early on. But you give it over to a steward who is going to make sure that it is available in the long term and adheres to FAIR. But good data management, making sure that you have the rights to share, whether it's human data or you're just working with colleagues, making sure that you're all on the same page about what's going to happen to this data once it's produced. Making sure you align to standards and providing metadata and doing all kinds of things to treat data as a first-class citizen, as we call it, something that is worthy in its own right and is not just an appendage to a paper that you publish, right? These are all things that researchers have to do. And of course, for that smart browser to happen in that portal, you need to have indexers and aggregators who take that data and make it available. And sitting over all of this are community organizations like the INCF, which help coordinate across these stakeholders and are involved in interpretation of things like community standards and making it easy for people to find and use them. So it really is a partnership amongst different stakeholders. And I wanted to go through a little bit of each of these entities and some of the roles and responsibilities. So first, neuroscience data repositories. Because I said they are the central actors in FAIR. And remember, Steve Kozlow in his 2000 vision said that we were going to be served by a federation of neuroscience repositories that are specialized. And that, in fact, is what has come into existence. There are data repositories that are maintained by multiple organizations with different functions, but they tend to be specialized along different axes. And I would say over the past 20 years, the quality of those infrastructures, while not perfect, has dramatically improved relative to the early days of informatics when we really didn't know what we were doing. And in fact, you're starting to see efforts by NIH and other funding agencies like, and other projects like Elixir in starting to standardize on the things that data repositories have to do and various certifications that are given to them to make sure that they're doing it well. So that has been a major advance and a major change. And the large brain projects, I think, really helped the state of infrastructure because they made huge investments in making sure that these infrastructures were available to handle the large sizes of data that were starting to come out and the complexity of data. So across the world, we have these various efforts. I think you're going to hear about eBrains later in a hands-on demonstration. And of course, I'm assuming you've already heard about it already. But in fact, I'd say that the state of neuroscience infrastructure has drastically improved and largely can handle pretty much anything that can be generated up to a point. And this just shows, if you look at the data types that it can handle, there's all kinds of different data types. They're not evenly distributed, but a lot of things for MRI, but also physiology, tabular data, electron microscopy, light microscopy. And if you start to look at these, I see somewhat of a dichotomy in that you can see that a lot of FAIR practices have made their way into these repositories. eBrains is a really good example. It was really designed along FAIR. But it is spotty. You can see that people who came up, for example, through a computer science tradition or analytics tradition often really focus on the software and less on how you handle the data. So you see FAIR is sort of implemented in a very spotty way. And I've been involved with the US Brain Initiative, first in the Brain Initiative Cell Census Network that ran until 2023 or 2022, and now in the Brain Initiative Cell Atlasing Network. And in the beginning, we had some repositories that largely came out of a tradition of the INCF, who'd handled FAIR principles very well. We had others that came out of these other traditions who didn't have anything at all that was associated with FAIR. But over time, they've started to implement them. And so over time, I would say that at least base level FAIR principles, identifiers, metadata, landing pages, have started to come into neuroscience repositories, but it is still uneven and somewhat spotty. So the INCF, as I mentioned, has really been at the forefront of trying to coordinate FAIR. I think the FAIR really came to neuroscience through the INCF. And as I mentioned, you can really tell the repositories that have been developed by people who are active through the INCF, because they do really take on this FAIR character much more so than others. But they've recently come up with a list of expectations for neuroscience repositories and scientific gateways. And they have an infrastructure portfolio list on their website where they evaluate infrastructures against these different expectations. So again, it's really starting to rally to make sure that if we're going to have this distributed ecosystem, that there's some commonality across them, so you don't have to learn 50 different interfaces and have 50 different sets of functions that it supports. Another area where I would say FAIR neuroscience has really made some strides is in the use of standards, the development and use of standards. The large brain initiatives, the INCF and other organizations around the world have really invested in creating these standards. And unlike 20 or 30 years ago, we're really starting to see islands of uptake. Uptake not just in the repositories, but also sometimes in the labs. And so you can see the yellow boxes are different types of standards, the blues are different infrastructures. And you can see that a lot of these standards are now being shared across these different infrastructures. And what does that allow, right? It allows then data to be transferred back and forth across them. So for example, I'll show an example in just a minute, where you now see infrastructures that are just for storing data like OpenNeuro, but then compute infrastructures that can take that data in and process on it. So we're starting to see some bottom-up organization of these repositories based on the standards that they support. And this is, again, a very big change over what had happened before, not just for neuroimaging, but for things like neurophysiology with the NWB, common data elements that are coming into existence. So this is a big and welcome change. That's just a blow-up of it. So again, the INCF has worked in this space. It has working groups that come up with some of these standards, but it also has a very nice standards and best practices portfolio where you can go and learn about these standards. It not only provides a review of these against a set of criteria and an endorsement if it passes them, but it gives you use cases, links to complementary standards, links to tools, online tutorials and discussion forums like NeuroStars and the training space, and eventually links to sample data sets. So it is easier for you to be able to import these into your lab and use them because there's now a lot of good material that has been aggregated by the INCF. So these standards are so important that you see that in my FAIR partnership, they pretty much appear in the first two, and they are really the underpinnings of effective search. Because once you have a standard that is implemented widely, you can query against that standard because you know the structure of the data and the metadata that is going to come out. So I want to talk a little bit now about researchers then. What is the researcher's role, right? These standards are so important, and what is it that researchers need to do? So it was interesting in this NASM workshop that a lot of people focused on the fact that we often think of data sharing, the unit of data sharing, as being the individual researcher. It's either the individual researcher or it's some large consortium. And basically what it said, a lot of people said this, was that the unit of data sharing should be the laboratory. The laboratory should be in the center. Because if you can share with your other colleagues in the laboratory effectively, if you can share with your future self after you come back to an experiment in a year or two, then you are likely to have something of value to share with the outside community. And Scott Frazier gave a talk. He's a provost at USC and a microscopist. And I think he really captured the current state of data sharing in the lab in most cases that I've seen. It says too many laboratories, the data are deposited in an archival repository and they are assembled just prior to submission. They have to find this data, they have to annotate this data, they have to prepare it. It is an unpleasant experience for which they perceive that they receive no value. And he basically said that if one could integrate fair practices throughout the data lifecycle, then those fair practices benefit the researcher in terms of them being able to do their science better. So that data management, we believe, is really the gateway to effective data sharing, and that is something that is very personal to the laboratory, right? It is not to the outside agency, it's to the laboratory. So a potential solution is all data associated with a research project are really managed in a way that is consistent with the FAIR principle, thereby lowering the barrier to making this available to the outside. And what does fair data management really mean? Well, at its heart, fair data management in a laboratory is an intentional strategy. It is not just the way that you manage your data when you're in the lab so that it works for you, but it is managed in a way to maximize its reuse by myself and others throughout the life cycle, okay? So this is personal to every lab, perhaps, but there are some infrastructures, there are some practices that we know are good. Research libraries are really getting into training people in data management. But here are some of the things that you would do. You really want to be able to share data with yourself, your lab, your colleagues, and then again, publishing it in a trusted repository so that it's available in the long term. So for example, this is a project we're involved in our laboratory called ReproNim, led by David Kennedy. And this is a complete infrastructure that is available for managing neuroimaging data all the way from inception all the way through in a fair manner, a complete computational infrastructure that is available. But of course, we often forget, if you're in neuroimaging, that neuroimaging discussions have dominated informatics, but it's essentially a born digital discipline. And many researchers who are dealing with wet labs and experiments, commercial systems, don't have the opportunity to create those integrated infrastructures from open source tools. But the good news is that there are various practices, and people are starting to share these, that you can implement in your lab that make it easy just using off-the-shelf components like Google Drive or Box or any of the cloud-based storage systems. So this is an example of one from a group that we work with that says this is how we manage data in our lab. We give everything a unique identifier so we can track it. So all subjects are in a master spreadsheet. And he said the interesting thing is that once he started to gather all that data and started to keep this record, progressive record, he started to notice drift in the types of subjects that he had. The weights got a little higher and maybe the sexes changed and things. And so good data management really is a benefit to the laboratory of itself, first and foremost. And if you do it well, then sharing becomes much easier. So now data aggregators, of course, very, very important. You need to be able to, if we're going to have a distributed ecosystem, there has to be a way to work with that distributed ecosystem. And I would say that this is the area that is the least well developed, but there are advances. For example, there's Google Dataset Search, and most repositories will mark up their data sets so that they are available through Google Dataset Search, so you can go and search. And I remember when we were starting projects in this area, everyone's like, well, can't we just have a Google for data? Turns out to be difficult. And then Google created this. But in truth, it's not very useful. It'll take you to a data set, but it doesn't really do very much. It's not that smart portal that we talked about. The INCF has created something called Knowledge Space, which currently queries over 16 different databases. And it does a little bit more than Google Dataset Search. It links it to various concepts, and it provides filters that come from there. So once you find a source, you can interact with it a little bit. But still, you are required to go to that data source if you want to use the data. But we are getting better. Alan mentioned the Canadian Open Neuroscience platform, and if you go there, you see that it does work on top of distributed data, but now you can see that you can directly download. I believe that's through DataLab, but I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. And that also, some of these you can link it directly to compute on CBrain. So this is getting closer to the idea of that smart browser that then also makes you able to use that distributed data all from that same portal. So I think strides have been made, although compared to the amount of data out there, they're still just very small islands. So, I know I still have some time left. I did want to talk a little bit about those 16, 15 different labels for the anterior cingulate cortex. So this is a little bit of a digression. Anatomy has been the foundation of neuroinformatics for a long time. It is the unifying thing that brings us together. But I would say neuroanatomy, more than any other anatomy, is just plagued by the sheer number of different vocabularies, parcellation schemes, and other things that you can use to refer to location in the brain. And it has been a real challenge. And every time we've gotten together with people whose job it is with knowledge representation, they're like, can't you just get everybody in a room and agree? And we're like, no. You really can't, not just because we're being perverse, but also because whatever technique you use is going to reveal something different. So our anatomy is very much dependent on how we study the things that we name. So one of the things, of course, and I think that's not a surprise here, is that we've relied on common coordinate frameworks in one sense, where we align brain slices to the same framework, and then we don't have to worry about the labels. The labels can be whatever they want. They are inherited from whatever parcellation schemes you have. And I would say that I am seeing more and more use of common coordinate frameworks, and I would say that in the case of mouse and rat, they truly are common coordinate frameworks in the sense that multiple groups use them. I think for human, non-human primate, and other species, we have common coordinate frameworks, but they tend to be used by one group or another, right? And they don't sort of cross barriers as well. This is just my outsider thing. But I'd say that there's been a lot of advancement on this. And if you followed what was going on in the BICCN, the Brain Initiative Cell Census Network, they published a series of papers back in 2022 on the motor cortex, where they used over 40 different techniques to look at individual cells to create this cell census of the motor cortex. And they did rely on registration to common coordinate frameworks to try to bring all of this data together. And this is going to be accelerated and expanded across the entire brain in the next phase of this project, the Brain Initiative Cell Atlas. So really, I think the use of space and spatial localization of things using MERFISH and other things are really allowing us to get these deep spatial maps that are not so dependent on the labels that we use. At the same time, because again, neuroscience spends a lot of, there are advances, there's new techniques, there's new atlases, new registration schemes, it's always going to be a moving target. And anecdotally, we found in the early days of the BICCN that depending on whether you used version 2 of the CCF or version 3, the motor cortex was not in the same place, okay? They were not in the same place because things change, knowledge changes. So one of the things that's important is really to track provenance. That's a very fair concept. And recently we published a paper, Lubia was on this paper, she's right there, in Scientific Data that proposed a model called ATOM, that provides a very precise way and a very fair way of referencing an atlas based on its version number that depends on 4 different components: the reference data, the coordinate system, the annotation set, and the terminology. So at the very least, if we cannot all converge on the perfect tool, which I think the answer will be never, we do need to provide precise machine-readable provenance so that we know that data set A comes from this particular version of the atlas, and data set B comes from another set. So this is starting to be used, I think, in eBrains and others to provide this precise referencing, and I think this is a very welcome advance. Another quick thing, because I know I'm running out of time, I believe, is that I wanted to talk a little bit about the SPARK project. So this is a project that I'm involved in called SPARK, which stands for Stimulating Peripheral Activity to Relieve Conditions. And I wanted to bring this up for multiple reasons. One, we're very proud of this project in terms of fairness, but also this is one of the first large initiatives that was devoted to the anatomy of the peripheral nervous system as opposed to the central nervous system and usually the cerebral cortex. So it really focused on the peripheral nervous system and its end organ CNS interactions. It was to support bioelectronic medicine, where you start to put stimulating electrodes into nerves and you see various therapeutic effects on it. So the SPARK portal itself delivers many different things. It's an open repository for PNS data. So if anybody wants to contribute it, it's open to everybody. It has a lot of multi-species, multimodal, and multi-scale data on the PNS. It's a cloud-based platform, of course. And it has various other tools, such as 3D organ scaffolds for mapping data, a simulation platform for running and sharing and publishing models, and also a knowledge base and maps of connectivity of the peripheral nervous system. So Spark really took to heart the FAIR principles, especially when it came to anatomy. And even though there are multiple groups participating in the creation of this platform, everybody is annotating to a shared vocabulary called the Spark vocabulary. So all anatomical locations are all referenced by a consistent vocabulary, regardless of where they occur. And those of you who annotate experimental data know that oftentimes the community vocabularies, the general vocabularies, don't have enough depth in order to be able to annotate very fine experimental details. So Spark allows the use of these custom terminologies that you need in the context of a given model or a given connection, but everything is related back to a common vocabulary called Uberon, which is used across multiple repositories. It's a multi-species anatomy ontology. And the way that we're able to do this is we leverage a system that was developed by our group called Interlex, which is an online vocabulary management system, which allows you to immediately mint new vocabulary terms that get identifiers and all the things you need from FAIR, but it also lets you do basic knowledge engineering to relate these terms to those core ontologies. So if you see a term like dorsal part of the serosa of the urinary bladder, the concepts serosa and urinary bladder are formally represented in the Uberon ontology. So everything is tightly knit together. And what this allows us to do is to create a detailed knowledge base where data, models, and tools are all put together. And one of the things that was created was SCAN, which actually is a connectivity knowledge base. And this map that you see over here that looks kind of funky, the reason why that looks funky is this is auto-generated by a machine from the knowledge base that contains detailed routings of nerves that go from the central nervous system out to the end organs. So this is all computationally generated from that knowledge base that contains those anatomical terms. And there we go. Here you can see how finely detailed these maps are. And in fact, they are detailed because we have a model of the neuron inside the connectivity knowledge base. So if you put a point, such as the inferior mesenteric ganglion, you can find all axons, all cell bodies, all terminals that all pass through there. So it's a very, very powerful example of what we can do with FAIR if one pays attention to it. Okay, so the final part is a little bit about incentives. It says the potential impact will be very great, but this potential will only be realized if researchers come to believe that the incentive for cooperation and sharing are greater than the costs. So there are various efforts that are underway to do things like citing data sets, and citing tools, and citing resources so that you get to count how many citations you got if anybody reused your data sets. So these efforts are coming, and if you look at things like eBrains and Spark, they'll give you a full data set citation that can be imported into a reference manager, so you can cite data like anything else, and the journals are more or less behind this. But I think this really requires that we pay attention carefully to how we treat our data. I mentioned this idea of treating data as a first-class citizen. What we see too often is that when people put data into databases, they don't provide a whole lot of metadata unless there's a curator or something that forces it. So on the right, you see a deposition of a data set that's called 202000611 AIBS mouse. You would never publish an article set of metadata that looked like that. You would never give that title to a paper. But people routinely do it to data sets because they feel that the data only exist in the context of this paper, and that attitude has to change. When you publish these data, you publish them as independent objects that are meant to exist on their own. But I already mentioned that some of the other benefits really are that if you manage your data well and you pay attention to data management in the lab, there are numerous benefits that do accrue to you. And this was a statement by Jan Bialy in that conference, that those who invest in data management and build a foundation of shared data in the lab that can be built on, they may take a short-term hit in retrofitting their laboratories, but the long-term benefits are enormous. And we're starting to see this in reports that are being published. This was a paper that was published by Keith Bush, who spent the pandemic really outfitting his lab to be standards compliant, fair, open, basically everything. And he published his experience saying that, learning some of these things, like the bid specification, was an enormous time sink. It really took a lot of time. But he said that the benefits of mapping our data to bids far exceeded the costs. And he's able to revolutionize the way that data was managed, the way they write tools, the way they handle data. So I really encourage you to think of data management and the mandates that may be coming down from your funding agency, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to really increase your laboratory and bring it into the 21st century. We are also finding that the curation and the attention to FAIR that is being paid by the repositories is also returning benefits back to the researcher. So when we do surveys in our various repositories, what often surprises the researchers who contribute data is how useful they find it. They tend to be one of the major consumers of that data because not only can they reliably find it through the web, they also have it nicely curated, so all the metadata is there, code, everything is nicely stored. So they start to see that putting this data in does return benefits back to themselves. Another benefit that really comes, and you saw this in the genomics community, once you started to have large amounts of public data, you started to have large numbers of tools that could work on that data. Computer scientists don't generate their own data, and they use this public data in order to create better tools, which again, reflect back to the community. And when we do assays of who's using and publishing on shared data, you often find that the tool users are right up there because they really require this to advance the field. So I'm going to very quickly go through community organizations. I've already mentioned the INCF as one of the really key developers of FAIR. And if you're not a member of INCF, I hope you join, because it really did serve as an incubator over those last 30 years, or since 2007 when it came into existence, of global neuroinformatics, and the infrastructure and what have you that you see really reflects its imprint. There's also efforts going on in the International Brain Initiative. So, for example, they have a data sharing and standards task force. They are addressing things like data governance across international boundaries. And Sean Hill, who's working with them, is going very deeply into creating knowledge graphs over neuroscience repositories. So, that was sort of a whirlwind tour, I think, through the different infrastructures. But let's ask that question again. Are we FAIR yet? And I would say the answer is not quite. But we have taken enormous strides towards FAIR, and I think that's really important. If we really want to realize that global vision of, or a vision of global neuroinformatics, we need to go deeper and pay attention to some of those 15 principles, but we're certainly in a lot better shape than we were. If a distributed infrastructure, one can argue the pros and cons. One thing that it does allow, though, is to rapidly adapt when new technologies come into existence. We can stand up new repositories as needed, right? We can take down ones that no longer serve their purpose. So I think the federated system is here to stay, but it does impose a little bit of a cost in terms of getting data in if you have to go across repositories, and also getting them back out. But for the first time, we're seeing true islands of interoperability that are really arising from the bottom up and not just through top-down efforts. And that turns out to be a really important way, I think, for something as vast as neuroscience. I think data management and data curation are really two essential pieces of the puzzle that are necessary to really improve the quality of data and lower the burden on people who are submitting data. And of course, community organizations will continue to be key drivers for FAIR. So Rome wasn't built in a day, but bricks are being laid every hour. I think that has very much been going on over the last decades. And I like Steve's quote at the end of that article that said, if and when we achieve our vision, then neuroscience will enter a new era of growth analogous to that which has transformed genetics. And the result will be a new depth of understanding of the nervous system and how it works in both health and disease. So, thank you. And thank you to my lab. I finished 5 minutes early. Yeah.
Questions for Maryann? There's one from the back.
Yes.
Speak up, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Stand up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Oscar McCullough. I'm a postdoc at Washington University in St. Louis.
Oh.
I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on a trend that I've been noticing in the last year or so, which is these data sharing entities. Some of them start out as publicly funded entities, but then realize that once you subscribe to their formats, they have a captive audience and they can go private in sort of a subscription-based model, and how that affects this whole system, and what we could do to sort of prevent that from happening.
That is a very good question. I just gave a talk earlier in the week, and that same question comes up. So I think the long-term sustainability of data repositories, especially researcher-run data repositories, is a giant challenge. I'd say it's one of the great unsolved challenges. But one of the reasons that, you see commercial entities and others getting into this, and very early on, at least I myself worked really hard not to have that happen, not to have a capture of the data repositories the way that we had a capture of our journals, because we're still digging ourselves out from that mess. But the idea that there's not going to be any costs involved, I think, is false. And the types of models that I prefer is right now, I think grant support is just going to be necessary for the near future. There may be some freemium models where, you have basic services that are always available and things that you can sell, because all of these repositories are scrambling for these models or trying them out. But for the most part, I don't think that any model that requires people to pay to access data is going to work. With one caveat, data sizes are getting so large, they're being stored in commercial clouds, and I know some repositories are requiring researchers to pay the download fees if they want to download them. If they want to access them in the cloud, they don't have to. But those fees, unless they're petabytes, are not gigantic. The other thing is that at least NIH and most funding agencies that I know are allowing researchers to put the costs for storing their data onto their grants. And we sort of feel that with data below a certain size, a sort of article processing charge, a couple $1,000s or whatever would be what's necessary. So I'm not going to guarantee that it will always be completely free, because it costs money to do this, and if it comes out of a research budget, right, research agencies don't like to do that. But on the other hand, I think if it is run by the research community itself, then the costs will be manageable instead of what we have if it's a commercial entity. And all of these things are problems. So, good question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting talk. And FAIR is definitely in Europe also a big challenge, yes. I would say. Speaking of 20 years in EU project, I would say I've seen gradually this improving, and that would be also my question, how the funding organization does it more on the FTE side. Not, you said, the publication fees, but in Europe we have something like a data management plan, which was as a deliverable voluntarily in Horizon 2020. Now in Horizon Europe, Digital Europe program, the new programs, it's a must. But this is just scratching the eyes on the surface, having a little bit of deliverables. So you need really FTEs, you need people working on metadata, as you suggested, right? It's one of the key problems.
Absolutely.
But then you need a master's student or two always alongside a PhD. And if you fund them, then they're not scientific enough, or the scientific excellence drops when you reduce the FTEs towards data management.
Yes.
So how you deal with these challenges, and is there something that the funding organization force on you in each of the single projects to go more fair? Thank you.
Yes. So that's another good question, and I think the way that laboratories are going to shift, or universities are going to shift in response to this, has not yet been written. We don't have enough people who know the domain well enough and then also have the skills to structure data. So I think that there's going to be sort of two trends that we see. I recently wrote a perspective in support of curators at the repositories, because what we found is that no matter how well-meaning researchers are, structuring data and knowledge representation are skills, and they are fields, right? It's not something that comes naturally to many researchers. They live in an analog world where there's a lot of free text. And you want them to provide the free text, right? The curators can't supply that, but the curators can structure it. What we found on multiple occasions in multiple different repositories is where you had people who were really customer service oriented. They said it's not an adversarial model like with journals where it's like you're lucky if we take your paper and then we're going to tell you everything you need to do. But rather, they tend to work closely with the researchers on their data to explain, to help, to improve. What we found was that knowledge started to transfer back to the labs. So over time, they started to say, oh, now I get why you're asking. That scheme that I showed of the laboratory with the A1s and A2s came from a researcher who was working closely with us. And over time, he internalized what we were saying. And he came up with this scheme on himself, which actually looked very similar to BID's, even though he had no computational or informatics experience whatsoever. But he started to internalize what you needed to do in order to manage data effectively. So I do think that there will be a professional class. I think the libraries want to take that on, but they don't have the deep domain experience. And so I am thinking it has to live at the repositories. And I'm thinking, at least that's what I said in my perspective, that it is short-sighted of funders not to put these people there at this critical time where we want effective data sharing. We cannot just dump that burden on the researcher. They won't do it, and I don't think they can do it. So I'm really advocating that all of these repositories have not just curators, but customer service-oriented curators who can help the researchers do what they need. Then you start to see the tools come in. So we've started to develop tools for Spark, for example, which are not just validators that tell you it's wrong, but it guides you step by step to try to help you structure the data the way it does. We found that that cut the average time from like 18, 20 hours down to 2 hours. But it took, right, that sort of mindset that says this should not be so hard to develop a tool that allows, that is a guiding tool instead of a, no, you got it wrong, here's the manual type of thing, right? Because I think that effect is not appropriate. And I don't think it's going to take forever. I think the impact of, ChatGPT and all of these things is going to be enormous, but it needs good data and it needs training data. So I think over time, if we fund these individuals for the next, decade, we'll start to see the returns just like nobody, and I think, Alan, you probably remember this one, you used to have somebody type your manuscript, right? You had to have somebody type your manuscript because it was very difficult to do. Once we had word processors, we do it ourselves because you didn't have to deal with whiteout and corrections. So I think if we invest now, we'll start to see the return on that they will become less and less necessary as these processes go in the lab. So it's not entirely satisfactory, but it's the best I can think of that would be scalable and achievable in this short period of time.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much.
I have a question.
Sure.
Should I use this?
I don't know.
I don't know.
How about this one?
I'll try this one.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that I think bedevils this whole business is it's a common problem with all of science, but I think it's particularly pernicious in this area, is that of the chaotic landscape of solutions.
Yes.
And the almost complete lack of due diligence about what this particular tool or platform offers, and whether it's new or whether it's duplicating and reinventing the wheel. And there's, as far as I can see, not a lot of strong leadership to essentially level the playing field so that you are assessing these various platforms and capabilities by their performance metrics, rather than who has the best marketing and hype engine. And I think we've all seen this for 20, 30 years. And it seems to me INCF, as one example, needs to take hold of this and put in place a set of assessment criteria which can be scored in a reasonable manner so that people can make a value judgment. Yes. People who are not living this life can actually make a fair assessment across these various options. Because right now it's chaotic.
I agree. And I think INCF is taking those first steps. It takes, everybody is resource limited. But the idea of the standards and best practices catalog is we don't just say, oh, wow, this looks really fabulous, let's put it in the catalog. It undergoes a rigorous review in order to be endorsed. And one of the key features is, has it been used by somebody independently of the group that has developed it, right? Because usability is everything, and that's where I think we often fall down. I also think that starting, the infrastructure catalog is starting small, but it's kind of the idea, and I want the idea of a certification of infrastructures as well that go along the same lines. I want an independent group to say, you show me all the fabulous things that I can do, but I go to your website and I can't do any of those things. I can't figure out how to do it. I think usability and having somebody who advocates between the user and the infrastructure is absolutely critical. Love my computer science colleagues, love my tech people, but they're awful at this. And that's what, when we took over Spark, we put these curators in, and they're like, these researchers are struggling, we have to help them. And the tech guys are like, we wrote the manual. And we're like, no, that's not good enough, right? You have to be able to help people through this because it's unnatural to them. So I absolutely agree with you, and I think INCF will go in that direction because now they haven't wanted to, in this early days, ding everybody on everything, but all infrastructures are not equal, right? Some of them really have made efforts, and we were really happy in one, for Spark, in one of the, there was a interoception meeting, and we were sort of pitching our repository, and there were a bunch of other repositories, and one researcher got up and she goes, I'm sorry, but I've tried to use all of those repositories and they're all stink and I can't figure out how to use it. She goes, now Spark used to be like that, but they really listened to us and they made it better, right? They made it, so now it's usable, she said. Now they help us. So I do actually think that does start to penetrate because they realize that they struggled because we're all resource limited, but as long as you try to help them through this and have the personnel to do so with that mindset, I do really believe that we can stop this sort of proliferation of things. And one other thing, just to make you a little, hopeful, because I'd never seen this before, but we were part of a grant, and people wrote the data piece, and they decided that they wanted to develop their own repositories. And the NIH program officers came back and said, no, there's already existing infrastructures. You need to use those existing infrastructures. So that's the first time we ever saw that, right? Because normally, I think one of the problems, Alan, is a neuroinformatician, it's a field unto itself. And when it's a field unto yourself, you build new things. That's what you do, as you were saying. You don't get careers by helping people manage their data. You don't get careers by doing those things. And that right now is a little bit of a vacuum. But I do believe that the state of neuroscience infrastructure is vastly different than it was a few years ago, and that now is the time, especially if you're starting these large consortia, to say, we need to take pieces that exist already and make them work. And a lot of them have the flexibility built in where that can happen. So happy to join that fight.
Hello.
Okay. Oh, another one. Yes.
Yes. So I would like just to mention two things and then ask for your opinion about it. So I'm thinking about like the social aspect of all of this. So I'm a PhD student, and then I think that in many labs the burden on the data management, the data sharing, whatever, goes to the PhD students, not the PIs. And in this sense, I think on the one way, well, it's a burden on us, and it's also the fact that we don't have the decision power about how things are done. So this is kind of a problem, And the other thing is that, well, about this, you were showing about the publications and the data sharing. Like, my question is like, would I have more chances of getting a job if I do more data sharing than if I do more publications? No. So in the end, it's like, right? How like the incentives? No. Like,
yes.
I'm gonna get a job if I shared more data. Like, is that going to count towards my brownie points as a scientist, or just the publications? No. So I think that's also a problem.
Well, so I think that what you're seeing are the early early steps towards trying to create a incentive system on data that is equivalent to our incentive systems on publications, which are citations. I don't know that that's going to completely work. Right now, you're sharing data because you have to. I think it's been studied fairly well that when you make your data available as part of a publication, you tend to get more citations of those papers itself. But whether you will get credit for publishing the data set that cured a disease or not, right? I think you can make the case. There is an effort in the US of the national academies to really now start to go after promotion and tenure committees, to say, right, how are we going to get to promotion and tenure committees? And when you talk to them, you talk to the Academic Senate in University of California, all of them say, there is nothing stopping you right now from putting in your published data sets. There's nothing stopping you from making the case that your public data sets are your real intellectual contribution. It's that people don't. And the committees themselves tend not to have any guidelines as to whether this is important or not, right? It's like, well, I don't know, a lot of people use this. Does that make a difference? Hard to say. So I would say that right now you're mostly following both your requirements, because you have to do this in many cases, partly your conscience, when what you think is right clashes with what the lab wants because it clashes with our incentive system. I have a whole ethics of data sharing lecture that I give. Then I say, it's really up to you to decide what you want to do. I think the good news is that open generally doesn't hurt people's careers. It doesn't hurt people's careers that I know of. People think it might, but when you sort of practice in an open way, you find a lot of people at UC elsewhere who've made their careers not just on using public data, but by building public data resources and putting that data out there. So I think it's really up to us to change that incentive system, and it's going to be slow. One of the questions that I'm asked most frequently is exactly that. I am a graduate student, but my PI does not want to do this. Now you have the mandate saying, well, you have to, okay, but are they going to let you devote that time? That's why I think the data management piece is so important, because you are managing that data. I don't know any PI that likes the graduate student to walk out the door with their data and not have any access to it. I've heard so much from PIs who were very hostile to these things that one of them came to me, big guy, and said, I've lost control of my lab. Back when everybody put things in cardboard boxes and they were stored on the wall, it was labeled with Maryann and I knew exactly where stuff is. Now I have no idea. That's why I think you're seeing the PIs recognizing that one of the big advantages they got from their postdoc or graduate student putting the data in the repository was that they could find it now. They could find it, they could point it to the next postdoc. So that's why I think focusing not so much on the publishing, but focusing on managing it really well in the lab, which is a tangible benefit, then the burden and the barrier to then making it public is much lower than it would be. That's what Keith Bush and others found. It's like, once I've done this, then it's really easy for me. Your PI comes and says, oh, we've got to get all the data that underlies this figure because nature requires it, and you're like, here it is, right? And we've seen those types of anecdotes. So that's why, even though data management seems like a boring topic and nobody would think of it as an incentive, I think the opportunity to invest in that is the gateway to data sharing. I think it's really what goes on in the laboratories, and that might be one way to get around that. So I was a little rambling, but.
I think we'll have to stop now. I think the issue you just raised is a generational one. You've got to educate the promotion committees about the importance of data science, data papers.
Yep.
But that's an education and evolutionary thing. It won't happen overnight.
That's right.
Anyway,
Okay.
we could be talking about these for hours, and like to thank Maryann for a fascinating and illuminating talk.
Thank you very much.